Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome at this seminar on the Indo-Pacific strategy of the European Union, a dialogue between Europe and Asia that is organized by the Egmont Institute, Egmont, the Royal Institute for International Relations of Belgium. These days, it seems every international player has to have an Indo-Pacific strategy to be taken seriously. Every think tank has to have a seminar on the Indo-Pacific to count. And so that is what we are doing today. But it is, of course, the geopolitical hotspot of the moment, and therefore quite important that we do some strategic thinking about this topic. I have the pleasure of introducing to you an excellent panel of speakers. I will, in a moment, first give the floor to George Cunningham, who's a senior advisor in the Asia and Pacific Department of the Union's European External Action Service. Then we will hear two voices from Asia, Dr. Chiaoning, who is at the University of Oakland in the US, actually, Dr. Hwee, who's in Singapore at the Nanyang Technological University. And finally, we will hear from my own colleague at the Egmont Institute, Tobias Gehrke. We've asked all the speakers to share their insights for about 10 minutes or so, and that leaves us ample time for debate. Please type your questions into the Q&A application. You can already do that while the speakers are added, of course, and I will moderate that debate afterwards. A warm thank you in advance for all of the speakers physically based on 3 continents. That's one of the advantages, at least, of an online event, that we can bring you together. Another advantage is that everybody can sit in their own chair, quite simply, which in EU context is also important, as we now know. I'm looking forward to a fruitful debate. With that, George Cunningham, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours, please.
And the mic is unmuted. Hello, everybody, and it's very nice to be with you. And thank you very much for Sven for inviting me, and I'm really honored to be with everybody on 3 continents and in different time zones. So thank you for coming, and thank you, the great audience, for being with us. I am responsible for this, the drafter of this council communication on the Indo-Pacific strategy, which was adopted by the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union on the 19th of April. And it's indeed, you might say, a fashionable subject in which think tanks are asking for speakers and analyzing, but this may last a little bit longer because this is just one of 2 documents that are going to be produced. I will talk about that later. The other one being the joint communication, which fleshes out the detail, much more detail, of what is intended in terms of our Indo-Pacific approach. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that the EU is pretty important in the region, #1 investor in the region. It's the top development assistance provider, and it's amongst the biggest traders in the Indo-Pacific region, which we define as stretching from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific Island states. That's the breadth of this region, vast region, actually. It's home to 60% of the world's population. It's responsible for 2/3 of global economic growth, and it has 3 of the 4 largest economies in the world outside the EU, being China, India, and Japan. Important for manufacturing, important for digital and technological development. 2/3 of global patent applications come from there. And also important in terms of climate change and the environment. More than 50% of global CO2 emissions, for instance, are the responsibility of that particular region, and a lot of mismanaged plastic waste. So really the core thing is the sort of the socioeconomic recovery that we'll have to get ourselves back on our feet after the COVID-19, and the importance of the prosperity of the region in terms of the recovery in Europe, noting that by 2030, between now and 2030, something like 90% of the world's middle class will come, the new world's middle class will come from that part of the world, which means, of course, that this is a great market opportunity. Investment opportunities continue to be great for the European Union in the region. So there's a lot of scope there. But of course, the problem is that there's geopolitical competition. It's intensifying in the Indo-Pacific. It's creating strains on trade and supply chains, as well as technological, political, and security areas. Military spending as part of the total global spending has shot up from 20% in 2009 to 28% 2019. Vulnerabilities in terms of the South China Sea, Strait of Malacca, and so on, of course, even Taiwan Straits. Issue of nuclear non-proliferation, human rights challenged in the region, and therefore, although there is the scope of great potential prosperity, it's fragile in terms of the security situation and stability of the region. So the European Union has to take an interest in what is going on and try to contribute positively to greater stability, we hope. So when it comes to the Indo-Pacific strategies, this is, the EU follows a number of countries that have adopted such policies. Japan actually back in 2007 first coined the phrase, and then Australia, India, USA only in 2017. Then ASEAN with its outlook in 2019, New Zealand and even the United Kingdom in 2021 produced Indo-Pacific strategies. Canada's is expected soon. Amongst our member states, France in 2018, Germany 2020, and the Netherlands as well, produced their Indo-Pacific strategies. And when the Biden administration, or before even the Biden administration came in, the new EU-US Agenda for Global Change, which was produced in December 2020, this was just after the election victory of Mr. Biden. The new EU-US Agenda for Global Change joint communication said increased focus will be placed on the Indo-Pacific region to help, which will be helping deepen cooperation with like-minded partners in the region. So it was the case that in December, the EU member states asked for such a strategy to be produced, and it being council conclusions, it could go much faster and be ready already by April. So the idea is that we're supposed to be contributing to the stability, security, prosperity, and sustainable development of the region, and based as usual on the promotion of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and international law. And our aim is to work for a sustainable, green, digital, free and open Indo-Pacific in full compliance with international law, in particular UNCLOS. Now, as you know, this Indo-Pacific has a certain meaning, which is normally sort of anti-China. But in fact, a number of these strategies have actually focused on inclusivity. All our member states have signed up to this, of course, but France, Germany, and Netherlands also strongly went on inclusivity, which means that everyone can benefit and we can cooperate with anyone in the region. And so it's along the lines of the strategic outlook of 2019 on EU-China relations, in the sense that we take our cooperation or work with China at different levels, depending on the policy areas. And we've transmuted this principle here. So we can work with China and with any partner in specific policy areas where we can find common ground based on shared principles, values, or mutual interest. And so when it comes to China, it is included in areas where we have this common ground, which of course will be climate change, biodiversity, and areas like that. But having said that, we also say in the strategy that we'll deepen our engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly with partners that have already announced Indo-Pacific approaches of their own, which I have already mentioned to you which ones they are just now. So to be able to do that, we've got a strategy which is broad-based. It covers the whole gamut of European Commission sort of areas of policy areas, but although we have added resilience of health systems as something new, And so we deal, and we will deal in the joint communication with all the areas such as the Green Deal, the technological cooperation, higher education, digital governance, sustainable prosperity. We will continue to have a trade agenda, beefed up trade agenda probably compared to the trade policy review that was just published beforehand. We're advancing the connectivity agenda, and in particularly we want to work with regional organizations. Being the EU, we always like that, and we can always contribute in terms of these multilateral fora. And so, and involved in that, of course, is also the human rights issue, which continues to be a major issue within the strategy. So, for instance, when it comes to trade and investment, we'll be looking at implementing and enforcing those that already exist with Japan, Republic of Korea, Singapore, and Vietnam. We will be entering into force investment protection agreements. We'll continue FTA negotiations, Australia, New Zealand, for instance. We will look into those other FTAs that we have mandates for to try and progress them eventually, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand, for instance. And then we scored well on the 8th of May with the EU-India summit, where it was decided to resume trade negotiations with India, which is quite a prize for us. When it comes to security and defense, that's one of the areas where the media picked up quite a bit on. And there, the phrase was, in the council conclusions was that the member states acknowledged as important to have a meaningful European naval presence in the Indo-Pacific in the future. So this is a kind of hook, and we'll be exploring that a little bit further in the joint communication. But advancing that plus this CRIMARIO, which is critical maritime routes domain awareness exercises, more joint exercises and port calls between Indo-Pacific naval units and European member state navies, and advancing our agenda in terms of our dialogues, particularly with ASEM and ARF. These are the kinds of things that will be involving ourselves further in terms of the maritime side of the whole idea. So I'm just being very brief because I don't have much time and we have many great speakers. So we've, as I said, just 1.5 months ago, we had the council conclusions. We are now getting the message out. We're consulting also the governments in the region. And we're looking for progressing the agenda, getting ideas together with a joint communication, which is planned for being issued by the High Representative and the European Commission in September 2021, mainly focusing on implementation. So that's it for now. I hope it's been interesting and look forward to hearing what everybody else has to say. Thank you very much.
Excellent, George. Thank you for that great intro and for staying on time. That makes my job easy. I have the pleasure now to turn to Dr. Chiaoning Su, please.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from Michigan, US. Thank you so very much for having me today. So when I first got the invitation, I thought to myself, as a communication and media scholar based in the US, how would I be able to make a contribution to this timely conversation with my co-panelists and their expertise in geopolitics, global governance, and global economics. So I'm thinking that given my discipline, I tend to approach international affairs from a rhetorical approach. I think we can all agree that political rhetoric, foreign policy, public discourses mutually shape one another. So today, I would like to use my time to focus on how the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific act as a rich example of political rhetoric. Specifically, I would like to examine this document alongside with the US strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific, which was also declassified earlier this year. So, thanks to George, Advisor Cunningham has done such a wonderful job introducing the EU strategy. So I thought I could start with a brief overview of the US document. So the US strategic framework for Indo-Pacific was first implemented as a classified guiding document for the executive branch in 2018. The Trump administration declassified the document in January of this year as it prepared to exit the White House. Now, many speculated about the timing of declassification, 20 years ahead of schedule and during a time of governmental transition. Some people see this fast-track declassification as a way for the Trump administration to ensure policy continuity under the Biden administration. Others see this as a way to reassure US allies and partners of its commitment to the Indo-Pacific. Regardless of the intention, I think the release of these two strategic documents in such a short time, one in January and another in April, I think inevitably invites comparison. And seeing both convergence and divergence myself, I want to compare these two documents in terms of their definition of Indo-Pacific, their issue priorities, and their rhetorical construction of rivals and alliances. So first is the definition of Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific really is a relatively new term, and it seems like every nation and every governing body tends to come up with its own boundaries for this geographical term. So in the US, the US began using this term under the Obama administration, along with Asia Pacific and Indo-Asia Pacific. The Trump administration began to define the term first, follow the Japanese definition of Indo-Pacific as the entire Indian Ocean, the Western Pacific, and the nations that surround them. Well, later on, the Trump administration revised the definition to simultaneously shrink the borders in the Indian Ocean to exclude Africa and Middle East, and to expand them to include the western coast of the United States. In other words, the US defined Indo-Pacific in such a way that it could claim membership for itself and align with the US military command structure. The EU Council, on the other hand, defined Indo-Pacific as a region from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific Island states. The definition, as many would suggest, roughly followed the expansive French definition first proposed in 2018 to include its geographically dispersed territories. I think the interesting thing here is the exclusion of the US from this definition. Definition, as we all know, is fundamental to identifying and solving problems. And in foreign policy, definitions of geography typically have diplomatic and political and policy implications. To see these two definitions together, the American version is a condensed vision of the Indo-Pacific driven by its security focus and its attempts to reinforce existing alliances. On the other hand, the EU vision of Indo-Pacific is more expansive and inclusive and is motivated by partnership building. These different visions naturally shape their issue priorities, I would argue. So if we read through the 10-page US document, the strategic framework to Indo-Pacific, I think it is very, very clear that the US prioritized security, and more specifically, a traditional understanding of security. So it is the military power of rival nations, it is terrorism, and the wildly ambitious nuclear disarmament of North Korea that serve as highlights of their security concerns. The issue of security in the US document is followed by concerns about the global economy and the continuation of compatible values and ideology in the nation, specifically fears over China's ideological penetration. Altogether, the issues of greatest concern to the US revolve around maintaining its prominence in the region of Indo-Pacific. The EU document, on the other hand, flips the order of issue priority. They begin with diplomacy, driven by cooperation rather than security concerns. The primary issues are truly global and not specific to the Indo-Pacific, and yet the Indo-Pacific will be key to their solutions. So we are thinking about human rights, climate change, global health, and disaster management all take on a far greater role in the EU strategy, followed by the economy. Security, on the other hand, ranks lower in this EU document. But interestingly, when security is mentioned in a manner that is more fitting of today's technological age, referencing cyber activities and the weaponization of disinformation. So judging from the issue priorities, we can argue that the US endeavors to reiterate its prominence in this narrowly defined Indo-Pacific region. And on the other hand, the EU tries to establish itself as an active global player through its collaboration with the region. And finally, I think for me as a media communication scholar, the most striking differences between these two documents are their rhetorical choices in terms of naming their rivals and alliances. In the US document, the naming of names is far more frequent in both cases. It is quite noteworthy that China is mentioned 54 times in the document to situate it as a political, economic, and ideological rival that must be tended to. The second nation of great concern to the US, North Korea, is mentioned 7 times and positioned solely as a nuclear security threat. Allies and partners are similarly mentioned, with India leading the pack at 29 times. The US obviously wants to position India as a counterbalance to China. Other members of the Quad also received mention: Japan 13 times, Australia 5 times, and more interestingly, the only other frequently named nations in this document are South Korea 5 times and Taiwan 4 times. As a result, the US strategy can sometimes appear to be a Quad +1 approach, with either South Korea or Taiwan joining the effort. On the other hand, I think the frequency of naming rivals also explains why some people would see the Indo-Pacific as a shorthand for anti-China in the EU strategy. In contrast, the EU document avoids naming and shaming. They frequently mention regional and global organizations, but only in the economy section does this document name specific nations. This rhetorical strategy reflects the long European traditions of not pointing fingers and emphasizing principles over actors to foster consistency and to make sure the strategy itself will be more resilient in the long term. Nevertheless, we should also ask whether the use of a broad and elusive language may possibly give too much room for interpretation and sometimes suit the interests of ill-intended actors. So overall, I think the takeaway here is that, first of all, is the timing of these two documents, released just 3 months apart by these two powerful forces. The timing itself really speaks to the level of global attention now being paid to Indo-Pacific and the significance of the region to global security, global prosperity, and sustainability. However, these documents, when read very closely, reveal two very different strategies and conceptions of the Indo-Pacific, the major players, and the objectives to be achieved. Comparing these two documents side by side, I think it is not hard to understand why a lot of people would refer to the EU document as a third way, as an alternative approach, as an alternative solution to engage the Indo-Pacific. Personally, I think the spirit of openness, collaborative partnership, and egalitarianism should be praised and celebrated. However, we should also critically reflect on the EU's attempt to stay neutral on a variety of issues in a region that is very much defined by escalating tensions and conflict, and what price will be paid by retaining such a position. In the meantime, if the EU is genuine and sincere in its promise to foster connection and inclusivity, then I think it needs to open its arms to welcome all like-minded partners, including Taiwan. As a young, vibrant democracy, a major player of the global supply chain, the 7th largest economy in Asia, a shining example of global pandemic governance, Taiwan should be included in any strategic plan to Indo-Pacific. Failure to do so would be a failure for EU to be truly inclusive. I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for those interesting observations. I propose, George, that afterwards, maybe before we pass to the Q&A, I give you the chance, if you want, to react to what the speakers have said. But I'm first now very happy to turn to Dr. Hwee Yeo, who will talk to us from Singapore.
Thank you, Sven, for inviting me to share some thoughts on this Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU. And very good morning to those in America, good afternoon to those in Europe, and good night to those in Asia. It's almost my bedtime, actually, because I tend to be a morning person and I tend to go to bed early and wake up early. But nevertheless, I have been listening carefully to what George has said and what Dr. Su has said, and find it very interesting comparison, especially by Dr. Su, on the different approach taken by EU and US in the strategy. First, I would like to make some remarks from my perspective as a Southeast Asian and someone who is very supportive or trying to be supportive of what ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, should be doing. Sometimes regional organizations like ASEAN does not always live up to the expectations, but I hope that the EU Indo-Pacific strategy would also provide ASEAN with a sort of a platform for it to gear up and work towards engaging the EU more in terms of finding an ally to be able to work with in order to navigate the increasing tensions between China and the US. So first, let me make 3 points with regards to the EU Indo-Pacific strategy. First, I think it is good that the EU is developing its own Indo-Pacific strategy, as Dr. Su has said, a third way of engaging the region that aims to be inclusive and hopefully with ASEAN at the heart of its strategy. What is important here, as also that's pointed out, is in the EU Indo-Pacific strategy is its emphasis on working with partners and trying to craft a cooperative strategy and working on common challenges. So here I think there is a particular synergy between the EU and ASEAN in 3 important areas of cooperation. I think in the Indo-Pacific strategy, there was the talk about ocean governance, which include topics ranging from tackling maritime safety, freedom of navigation, anti-piracy, to issues like common concerns over marine pollution, sustainable management of marine resources. And I think this tie in with the maritime topics that is in the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. So in that sense, I do see the synergy between what ASEAN and EU wants to do in terms of in the maritime sphere. Then the second area is, of course, connectivity. I think George also mentioned that connectivity is very much a very big part of this EU Indo-Pacific strategy. In both the ASEAN and EU Indo-Pacific strategies, the priority is placed on connectivity. And so I see much that both regional organizations can do to pursue and really look into the different dimensions of connectivity, the infrastructural connectivity, and of course, more important, the governing framework in terms of looking at the fiscal, social, and environmental sustainability, and the norms and standards that are applied in all these connectivity projects. Then the third area which I see synergy between for EU and the ASEAN to work together is in the area of strengthening regional organizations. In the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, I think they have stated that the desire to strengthen regional organizations. And I think this is particularly important for ASEAN, especially if it is to maintain its centrality in the Indo-Pacific. So any commitment and support from the EU to strengthen ASEAN and shore up ASEAN's centrality will be, to me, a good start to the strategic partnership between the EU and ASEAN that has been announced last year in December. Second point I want to make is that, again, it's good that the EU is developing its own Indo-Pacific strategy to signal its own commitments to strengthen its strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy. I think there's a signal that it will pursue policies to defend its own interests and not be drawn unwillingly into the US Indo-Pacific strategy of corralling its allies against China. It is important for the EU Indo-Pacific strategy to be assertive in defending its values, defending the rule-based multilateral order, and be a principled and at the same time show that it is a pragmatic actor. I think it's important that the EU Indo-Pacific strategy is not a reaction to what is happening, but to me it's important that this is something that the EU itself has really thought out and wanted to make a point to make its own stance, and that it is not something that in response to, say, pressure from the US or pressure from the member states itself to have a strategy. So to me, it's important that the EU stood by its own values in this Indo-Pacific strategy and not be forced to, in a way, if I may be blunt, if the EU Indo-Pacific strategy in some way become closely aligned with the US Indo-Pacific strategy, then I think the value of it would be undermined. So I think, I hope Dr. Su is right in the sense that the EU has come up with an Indo-Pacific strategy that is a third way, that is a signal that it wants to be an independent player in the multipolar world. Third, I do have a question regards to the geographical scope of the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. I think Dr. Su mentioned and George also mentioned that the geographical scope of EU's Indo-Pacific spans from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific Island states. When I read this together with the recent trade policy review paper published by DG Trade in February this year, I think the EU seems also to be moving its focus to Africa. I do not have issue on this, except to say that it signals that the EU is aware of the challenges and also the opportunities in Africa. And we can see in the coming months a more concerted return of the EU maybe to Africa in accordance to its interests. This perhaps brings me to another question I have in mind on the usefulness of an Indo-Pacific strategy that spans such broad geographical scope, and if it would actually serve the EU better to build on its global strategy of 2016 and use it as an overarching framework to connect the dots on different regional strategies, right? different regional strategies towards Asia, towards Africa, and its immediate neighborhood. So this is something I sort of have a bit of doubts in terms of why the rush to have an EU Indo-Pacific strategy when for quite a long time the EU has sort of stuck on its focus on having looking at the region as an Asia-Pacific region rather than Indo-Pacific. So why the change in perspective from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific? And why not build on the global strategy of 2016, which I thought is a good document, which also looked into the different priorities for the different regions, Asia to its immediate neighborhood. So this is not a question I have in mind when I was reading the Indo-Pacific strategy. And when I was thinking of the Indo-Pacific strategy, I know George also deals quite a lot with the Asia-Europe meeting, the ASEM process, which he has mentioned. It comes to my mind that wouldn't it be in the EU's interest or priority that it should actually have a Eurasian strategy when it comes to what is happening in its immediate neighborhood, with what is happening in Russia, Belarus. So I was thinking, if I'm a EU policy maker, I would probably give more priority to framing a Eurasian strategy with ASEM as the cornerstone. So this is another sort of question I have in mind in terms of the EU Indo-Pacific strategy. Is it really so important for EU to have an Indo-Pacific strategy? Or in fact, it should be building on the platforms that it already has in ASEM and use that to think about its Eurasian strategy, for instance. So I think George mentioned, and also in the fact sheet, in the EU fact sheet on the Indo-Pacific, it put forth justifications on why it's important for the EU to have an Indo-Pacific strategy, because the Indo-Pacific matters, because it produces 60% of global GDP, over 60% of global trade, and is home to 3 of the largest economies outside Europe, and mentioned China, India, and Japan. So when I compare this to what EU's fact sheet on ASEM, it strikes me as almost similar, right? ASEM represents 65% of global GDP, 55% of global trade, and it's also home to the 3 of the largest economies outside Europe. China, India, and Japan are both in the ASEM process. So to me, again, all these things, I know I'm being maybe a little bit incoherent, but all these things sort of make me think. It's good that the EU wants to show its independence, perhaps, or maybe to say that it has a different way of engaging the Indo-Pacific strategy. But at the back of my mind, I couldn't help wondering, is this a sort of a knee-jerk response? Or is this something that the EU has thought through carefully, that it has to have an Indo-Pacific strategy because everyone is having one? So I will end with that question in my mind, and hope maybe George can enlighten me further on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I can see George beginning to itch probably to provide some answers. But first, I will turn to my colleague, who you might not know from the blurry background, is actually sitting just across from me in our offices at Egmont, Tobias Gehrke. Tobias, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sven, also for bringing me in, and hello, good afternoon from me. Really difficult to follow up on the very sharp and comments and remarks that my fellow panelists have already made. So let me try to add where possible and come in a bit from the angle I observe these things, which for me is a EU geoeconomic angle. And maybe going back a couple of years, to me, when I think about EU geoeconomic strategy, the last 2-3 years have really been quite different. They have been driven by debates of sovereignty, autonomy, but they have been really inward looking. I think EU strategy has been quite defensive. We're talking about, well, how do we keep our industrial competitiveness? How do we protect the single market? How do we protect our crown jewels, our industrial crown jewels? How would you make them the strategic industries and their supply chains resilient for the future and so forth, which is, I think, was quite inward looking here in Europe. But now with this Indo-Pacific Council conclusions, and maybe even more importantly, the fact that connectivity and the connectivity strategy is gaining traction again, also here in Brussels and across Europe, seems to also, to me, indicate that the pendulum is swinging back towards a more offensive approach from the EU, towards a more outward-looking approach to build and to leverage global networks and not just the single market. And I think that's a very welcome development. It highlights, I think, a more balanced strategy that's coming up and is a good signal and to our partners. And by interpreting also what Dr. Su and Hwee always said, I think is overall a good signal. Yeah, let me make 3 short comments in a couple of minutes ahead. Also follow on the strategic considerations from the European side on the Pacific. Secondly, I want to briefly talk about its geoeconomic elements, and the big point is, of course, how do you actually realize them? On the strategic considerations, now there's honestly not much I can say. There's been, very sharp comments by Dr. Su and by Hwee on really working out the details and the distinct differences between the EU approach and, well, the American approach, but more generally, maybe also the approach from the Quad, so the US, Australia, India and Japan, who I fully agree have taken quite from the reading, quite a different rationale of how and why to engage the Indo-Pacific, where China and Chinese strategic expansion through maritime and naval expansion, but also through critical infrastructure plays one of the key roles as was highlighted. Whereas for the EU, the premise is, I agree also here with what George said, is quite the opposite. It's to prevent, I think that's really comes out of the reading, to prevent that the Indo-Pacific becomes dominated or defined by this American-Chinese rivalry. And the notion of inclusiveness, I think, was stressed over and over. On the geoeconomic elements of the strategy, I think it's littered. There's lots in it, and it speaks about quality, connectivity, and resilience, and trade, digital regulation, etc., etc. But indeed, I mean, George highlighted them and mentioned them, but indeed, there's not really anything new, I have to say, on the geoeconomic front. Everything is already there. On the connectivity side, we have a connectivity strategy. We're trying, the Europeans are trying to update that. The trade side, the trade strategy has just been published 2-3 months ago, which highlights the same points, I think. On the digital side, the Commission is going to publish a global digital cooperation strategy, which goes into more details on these points, I think. There's a research and innovation strategy, a global one. And we also have on the environmental side, in the Green Deal, we have, of course, the Green Alliance as mentioned. And all of them are then repeated in the Indo-Pacific strategy, which I think, as George highlighted, is trying to integrate them all and binding them together under one geographic roof, which is maybe not a bad thing. It's concentrating minds and concentrating the Commission, but also the member states on where things are happening. But in fact, all the strategies and the instruments are arguably already there. But then to the third part, how do we actually realize that? And that's, it's obviously a very broad agenda on the geoeconomic side alone. I'm not even speaking about the security defense side, obviously. But yeah, when I think about how do we engage, how should the EU engage partners in the Indo-Pacific? And broadly, I think in Brussels also many people think about Japan, because Japan, the EU-Japan partnership really embodies currently all of these aspects, I think. There's a connectivity partnership with the Japanese. There's, of course, a trade and investment agreement. There's digital connectivity also. Japan and the EU have data protection adequacy, so there's real data flow between these two, something that the EU has trouble with agreeing with other countries. There's strong research, innovation cooperation. There's several discussions with the Japanese in different frameworks on supply chain security, supply chain resilience. And of course, since last week, or was it 2 weeks ago, the first green alliance between the EU and the Japanese is also trying to externalize the Green Deal now to the external. And so it's a really diversified relationship on the geoeconomic side alone. And yeah, I think the Japan-EU relationship has really become maybe the most important geoeconomic partnership for the Europeans, certainly in the Indo-Pacific. So yeah, to me, I think the hope would be to replicate this kind of diversified relations with partners, because often in the past, on the economic front at least, it's been rather narrow as trade agreements, but trade agreements can only do so much. They're quite narrow in what they can achieve and what they want to achieve. And they're not only about trade liberalization, there's of course regulatory chapters, but they're also quite limited. And so I think it's trying to put relations on several footings in different frameworks is really something worthwhile. The EU-India connectivity partnership that was agreed recently is, I think, promising, and one can hope that this relationship can also progress on all these other pillars. But obviously, there's a lot of issues at stake, and just to conclude, maybe in a couple of minutes left, on the one thing that I also think that is the most important aspect for the EU's geoeconomic engagement in the area, and that's connectivity, and that's real infrastructure projects. And we can all cite how many investments EU businesses take in Asia or in the Indo-Pacific, and but it's not really too representative, I think. For me, more importantly, would be to have more strategic thinking as what are strategic infrastructure projects that the European Union wants to develop. And that, of course, demands to ask what is critical to us and what is strategic to us. Now, sustainable infrastructure projects are important, and we have to, of course, help also economic development in emerging economies. But that's only one side of the discussion. And there's another side, the more strategic security-minded side, that is ongoing quite strongly, I think, here in Europe. We have an industrial strategy. We have an update to industrial strategy where the Commission also worked out already six strategic industrial areas. It analyzed critical goods that we need to supply, where we have potential vulnerabilities, where we have potential huge demands in the future, where we have potentially high dependencies that need to be addressed, particularly, for example, for raw materials. There's a whole raw material strategy that gives all these ideas and how can we make sure that in 20 years' time, when demand will rise so rapidly, we are resilient in their supplies. There's the digital agenda that also highlights, digital infrastructure, in Europe from undersea cables and how they connect to our direct partners. But I think there's very little focus on these things so far in the actual projects that we developed. There's a real gap between the kind of things we discuss for us, strategic for us internally, and then what we do actually abroad. And I think that's really that's still really much a problem. That is connected, of course, also to the funding problem in Europe. We have no direct budget line for connectivity projects for the EU. Now, there is, of course, a lot of financial tools, and the money is there. The member states have money. There's all sorts of EU budget lines and European bank budget lines. But pulling them all together under one strategic narrative, one strategic guideline has proven still very difficult also in the last 3 years. And that's really, I think, sort of the first task for us if we want to really get real about this, to try to pull that more together here in Europe. There's talks about a digital connectivity fund where, for example, then only for digital connectivity, we could pull resources together. The resources are there, but maybe also more about showing that we are serious about this and that we have trying to centralize our capabilities towards a central fund and towards central funding opportunities. Yeah, maybe on that note, because I'm already 10 minutes in, I'll leave it at that and come back later. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Tobias. George, if you want, and I guess you do, please do react to some of the comments made. I'll throw in one question received that goes in the same direction in the chat that asked, well, is there something really substantially new in here, or is it more a rebranding or a regrouping under the heading of Indo-Pacific of a number of existing strategic orientations? Back to you, George.
Great, and so wonderful to hear all those opinions and a lot of support actually for the work that has been done. I think the first thing to say is that we have an Indo-Pacific approach or strategy because others with whom we are working in the region where we have been, you know, for a long, long time, we need to have a conversation. We need to know what are our policies, what are our definitions, to be able then to interact with each other. So people always have questions and questions and questions, and then you actually have, among those that have Indo-Pacific strategies, they have defined what they're talking about, and now we have defined what they have defined what they're talking about. We have defined what we're talking about. So this is a lot to do with this. The global strategy is something produced under the previous High Representative. There's no particular intention to move and do anything new, but of course the world moves on and priorities change. And one of the things also the strategy has done is to remind us within Europe of what's going on with the Indo-Pacific and the importance of the Indo-Pacific to our own economic prosperity. All the focus had been, as you well know, if you look at the Trade Policy Review, recent one, you know, it's the neighborhood, and it's Africa. And by the way, there is Latin America and Asia Pacific. So this has kind of then rebalanced everything and brought to the attention of everybody that actually the future of the Europe does very much depend on the success of the Indo-Pacific and our ability to be able to be part of that success, hopefully. So it's also a sort of a, I would say, a very positive approach to the region, deliberately so, because we look for the benefits that everybody can have, both the benefits of people with more investment within the region, and of course the investment that comes and the trade that comes to our part of the world as well. So that kind of gives you maybe some idea on that particular issue. Although we have seen all these opportunities, not to forget, of course, that we're also looking, when it comes to ASEAN, at the slippaging that is taking place, not just in ASEAN, but generally slippages in human rights. And we're concerned about that. Difficult to know what to do about it. We have new tools and instruments, but it would be great to have a way forward on this, because that is an area where we think there's real a deficit taking place and we can't fix it. Mention was made by Dr. Su about all the counts of countries and how many and so on. You'll see in the joint communication that will come out in September, we do mention a lot of countries, but what we do is we're mentioning them in terms of, okay, we're going to do trade deals here, we're going to do the technological, work here, and so on and so forth. And you'll have countries, but they're going to be more specifically, these are the countries in these particular areas that we're cooperating with as much as possible. So you'll be able to do your counts, but it's not as meaningful, except to say simply, perhaps, we're working especially with Japan because they have this amount of counts in the thing. Now, on the third way, I'm not sure if we really see it as the third way. We've never discussed it as a third way, but it is true that, we want to practice our strategic autonomy and take our own decisions. And of course, if they are somehow align themselves with different people at different occasions, this is the palette that we want to work for. So I'm not sure if that's a third way, or maybe it's a third way in the sense of a kind of non-aligned way of doing things, taking opportunities when they come, hopefully. When it comes to ASEAN, I wanted to say that the first trip to the region is taking place right now, and the High Representative has gone to Indonesia and is visiting ASEAN officially. So just to say that that is the priority that is clearly indicated with such a long trip going out of Europe for a whole week before the High Representative is going on now. On the issue of connectivity, actually, on a personal basis, I entirely agree with what Tobias is saying. Connectivity is a part of the totality of what we're projecting. It's not a central part. It is one of many important areas in the Indo-Pacific approach. And indeed, there has to be somehow a way found to be more strategic in the approach. And indeed, there have been all kinds of issues concerning the difficulty in grouping money together and having a particular vision. Hopefully this can get sorted out, but I just confirm to you that there is an issue here concerning strategic infrastructure that nonetheless people are working. What's new in the strategy? Well, you'll see in the joint communication what's new, because then you'll start identifying all the countries in which areas they are sort of going to be benefiting and working in partnership with the European Union, including on technology. So that is yet to come. These are council conclusions, actually rather long council conclusions. Normally what happens is you have a joint communication first, in which there's a kind of detailed review of the situation. And then it goes to the council, the foreign ministers, and then they take bits and they say, yes, 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 this is great, go ahead. This time we did it differently. Therefore, the council conclusions are much longer, much more detailed. And then you have the joint communication nonetheless that will add information concerning the implementation. So that is still to come. I have, I hope, covered quite a number of areas, and I leave it at that for the time being. Thank you. So therefore, sorry, just quickly to say, what's new at the moment in terms of the council is security and defense, which you have the sort of the beginnings of quite a lot of activity taking place in security and defense in the region. And in particular, so acknowledgement that naval activity should start taking place as well, much more frequently and much more engaged. We have the Atalanta project, which is in the Indian Ocean, but we want to do more in different parts of including domain awareness raising, even as far as the Southern Pacific. Finally, not to forget that we have France, of course, which is a Pacific power in its own right, which has 1.5 million citizens living in the Pacific area, and therefore, in fact, there is, from the viewpoint of that particular member state and that importance of that member state, and great interest also for that reason for us to be involved in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. I will now give you a first set of questions. We have 3 questions on issues and 3 questions on countries. The 3 questions on issues is there any impact on the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy? 1, of Brexit. 2, of the debate, which seems to have restarted a bit on the origin of the coronavirus and might this stir up things. And 3, of the US-Russia relations also. Does this have an impact on the Indo-Pacific? Then there are 3 questions on countries. 1, where do you see any common ground, or where do you see the most common ground between the EU and US for joint action in the region? Secondly, specifically, which role do we see for Vietnam in cooperation EU-Vietnam? And finally, in this round, China, of course. There's one question that asks, well, if there is a strong plea to focus on ASEAN, how would it be received in China, which prefers bilateralism rather than multilateralism? And also, still a sort of overall question: is all of this aimed against China, or can you sort of talk about this regardless of China, or without taking into account the current state of EU-China relations and the sanctions? How must we see this? So that's only 6 questions. Don't feel obliged to pick up all of those, but please pick and choose. And let me first turn back to you, George, and then take the speakers in the same order again. Yeah, you have to unmute.
Yeah, thank you for those questions, which are very penetrating. When it comes to Brexit, of course, there has been an impact, a reduction in the, of course, of funding for development assistance and so on, albeit the UK has since then cut themselves from their 0.7% target by a third. But we're still, in that respect, the largest development assistance provider in the world, irrespective of that. Obviously, an impact on naval vessels, where the Royal Navy, British Royal Navy, is responsible maybe for about a third of the fleet or even more. So that obviously has an impact as well. Yes, so obviously it's not been a happy story to lose the UK. However, I'm happy to say that, as Dr. Yeo knows, in ASEM context, the UK is very much involved with the European Union and Norway and Switzerland in working together for good results. So we haven't entirely lost the UK on that matter. And in fact, the UK is reaching out to us on the Indo-Pacific, they having also produced a strategy this year looking for potential cooperation. And of course, in terms of military cooperation, which is largely outside the Indo-Pacific region, then of course the UK is still interested and involved with France and so on, in diplomatic issues with Germany and France and others. So UK is very much involved on its own terms, despite the fact that there have been serious losses. Also their expertise, of course, thanks to Brexit. On the COVID-19 and the sort of the origins, where I don't think the EU is too much engaged in that issue. It is important to know what happened, but on the other hand, we're not demandeurs on that particular issue. Something I forgot to talk about with Dr. Yeo is this idea of Eurasian and so on, turning to the US-Russia relationship. Of course, the relationship between US and Russia is not good. The relationship between the EU and Russia is also, unfortunately, not good. And when it comes to Eurasia, when it comes to Russia, and when it comes to ASEM, then of course this bad, not very good relationship, regretfully, sort of permeates into the ASEM side of things as well, unfortunately. So not having Russia as a complicating factor, if I may say, in a kind of Indo-Pacific approach is I think, good for us. Good for us, because we have things are getting worse, unfortunately, with China, but on the other hand, we're still talking, we're still meeting, we still are strategic partners, and we still have issues that we can work on together. So with China, it's quite different from the dealings with Russia, nonetheless. On countries, just to highlight, of course, Vietnam is a very good example of common interest. Vietnam is very friendly towards the European Union. And indeed, as Dr. Yeo will know, there's the 25th anniversary coming up of ASEM, and they're hosting a special meeting in North Vietnam, in Vietnam on a particular on the ASEM, the future of ASEM. And obviously that's done also as a gesture towards us. So I think there's a lot of scope there. And as you know, we love ASEAN, so we want to do as much as possible, though we would really like to find a way in which we can deal with the human rights issue among some of its members there. So I'll leave it at that for the time being, because I will talk too much. I'm going to keep quiet for a while. Thank you.
Thank you, George, but that were very enlightening answers. Chiaoning, what would you like to pick up on, please?
Yeah, I think there was a question about, is there a common ground for EU and US to work together despite the differences in terms of their strategic framework? I think that was such a wonderful question. I'm thinking, like, if you think about international relations from the perspective of diplomacy, ideology, military, economy, I think especially in the area of ideology is what the US and the European Union can work together. Both of them advocate for the idea of democracy, for the idea of human rights. This is really something that they can work together. Especially, I think this is a time that, you know, there was a time I think we really can compartmentalize politics and economy and morality. I think there was a time that kind of separation and compartmentalization is possible. But I recently think this kind of separation is less and less visible. A lot of recent incident, for example, H&M is boycott, canceled in China. Do we see that as a political issue? Do we see that as a issue about the Chinese market? Do we see that as a advocacy or a violation of human rights, right? So I really do think it is probably on the issue of ideology and morality that it will be the easiest for the US and the UN to work together and to have a stronger stance on those issues. I also think that when we think about military or national security issues, it is very important to not to just think about that through the traditional lenses, like the military forces, the naval presence. We should also think about, you know, cyber attack. We should also think about disinformation. Based on my understanding, I think China is making this proposal, the new IP proposal to ITU, International Telecommunication Union, to propose a more controllable, centralized internet space, which is a great security concern to the rest of the world. So I really do think that if you think about those issues, I see a lot of room for the US and EU to work together.
Thank you very much. Hwee, please.
Thank you. Let me just sort of talk broadly, talking about, you know, of course, there will be common grounds that EU and US can work together. And again, I think Sven, yourself, you have written quite a bit that when you work together, I think EU has to be very clear about what is in its interest, right? And start from and take that as a starting point. So I think there are going to be increasing pressure from the US on the Europeans, for instance, to align, say, their positions towards China. We know the US has openly said that we are in this extreme competition with China. And so I think we are going to see perhaps some sort of pressure from the US on the Europeans to try and, like I said, align the positions more closely towards China. So to me, the EU can either capitulate and join the US, ending as a junior partner and taking the world into a very dangerous new Cold War, if it decides to do that. Or alternatively, the EU can stand its ground to achieve true strategic autonomy, to uphold multilateralism, to really emphasize a rule-based multilateral order. I think it has a chance to establish itself as an independent pole if it seeks to work proactively with other like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific, and there are many they can work with. Yes, there are issues about human rights with ASEAN, but they can work with Japan, they can work with South Korea, as we mentioned. And like I said, I would like the EU to really find some way, and of course for ASEAN need to reciprocate, to find ways to work with ASEAN in order to put real substance into this newly established strategic partnership with ASEAN. Of course, ASEAN is has lots of its own problems. We see the coup in Myanmar, but that is exactly one of those common challenges where I think if we are serious about a strategic partnership between EU and ASEAN, that is where the dialogue between EU and ASEAN really need to be taking place on how we are going to deal with the issues in the way that can be helpful, rather than to just feel good about it and impose sanctions, right? So I think there are many tough issues. And, you know, we have been talking, and I know in Europe, there's been a lot of unhappiness, and we have been talking about how interdependence can be weaponized, how trade and economy can be weaponized. Similarly, I feel that sometimes human rights issues are also being weaponized, right? So we all need to take a good look at ourselves and think about how we approach relationship in looking at being in a way that is pragmatic and not too ideological. We need to be pragmatic in the sense that we have to really look at what are the problems, common challenges that we all face, and how do we find a way where there can be a sort of a peaceful coexistence. We may not like each other, but we need to learn to live with each other. and so I hope that in that sense, when the EU is sort of fleshing out its Indo-Pacific strategy, it really need to think of what role it wants, what role really it wants to play, what is its relevance. And George talked about the problems it has with Russia, but precisely because you have the problems with Russia, I thought at least there is the Asia-Europe meeting platform for it to try and find some way to engage. Now that maybe bilateral engagement with Russia is a bit difficult, but using the multilateral platform like the Asia-Europe meeting may be one way to try and find a way in to engage in some sort of a dialogue in order to resolve, or not resolve, but at least to be able to talk about some of these difficult issues that the EU face in its own immediate neighborhood. Another thing I wanted to sort of bring into, again, the thing about connectivity, right? Connectivity has been such a sort of something that everybody wants to focus on. In the Indo-Pacific strategy, there's a lot of talk about building connectivity. And then I think again back, because I'm an ASEAN person, I've been looking at the Asia-Europe meeting process for so long that I thought, you know, the EU itself has successfully actually used the Asia-Europe meeting platform to shape the narratives on the connectivity agenda. So why should it not build on this, right? I mean, the EU has shown its intent to compete so-called robustly in the geopolitics of connectivity by shaping the narratives on what connectivity should be, promoting fair and sustainable connectivity. Right? And it has in 2018 published its EU strategy on connecting Europe and Asia. It has talked about working with Japan on the connectivity strategy. Why don't build on all this that has already been put out there in order to achieve all these priorities that is talking about, instead of turning its attention to another strategy, Indo-Pacific strategy, and all that. So again, I come back to that puzzle I have in my mind, right? On what is the value add of the EU Indo-Pacific strategy for the EU itself?
Thank you very much. And then I turn to Tobias, and meanwhile, Tobias, a specific question on connectivity came in, i.e. which strategic investments would you yourself propose that the EU should undertake? So maybe you can pick that up as you go along. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Maybe I start also quick comment also on the EU-US cooperation on connectivity, following up on Hwee. I think there's good room for cooperation, because what the Americans do on connectivity, what they've developed specifically in the Trump administration, I think there's very different approaches. Some of that developments, specifically, for example, the Clean Network initiative, it reads very confrontational. It's based on pushing back China. It's a US-driven agenda to which then countries, for example, were offered loans or investment if they renounce Huawei, if they renounce Chinese investments. I think that's, you know, the wrong approach. But there's also other ones. There's, for example, the Blue Dot Network, or the Blue Dot Initiative, which was also developed, I believe, under the Trump administration. It's been, I think, quite a stalemate for now. But there's signs that the Biden administration is picking up on this. It's developing a set of standards for investors to which all sorts of countries can sign up. It's an alliance. It's not necessarily dominated, hopefully, by the Americans, to which then, and it's based, at least the idea, I think, on multilateral standards. You know, whether they are from the OECD, or they may be drawing from ASEM or Asean or something like this. These are, I think, the kind of venues where Europe wants to you know, cooperate also with the Americans on defining standards that are not dominated by the Americans, but that to which at least a number of countries agree on multilaterally, that are not China specific, but they're based on sustainable standards, for example. On the strategic investments, yeah, so I mentioned in my remarks that, for example, we have identified in Europe, we're not the only ones in Europe, but we also have identified that we are dependent on strategic critical minerals from abroad. Many of them we draw from all around the world. Demand will rapidly increase in the next 20 years for all these technologies that we want to develop to bring the Green Deal and the digital transformation forward. But then, of course, we also have to have a foreign policy dimension to this. Some of the strategy says, well, okay, we need to do something at home. We need to recycle these minerals better. We need to maybe develop, first of all, new technologies. We need to develop maybe sustainable mining in Europe again. But then there's a foreign policy dimension. And that is to say, we need to cooperate with these countries who actually mine, who already have mining capacity, who might not be mining sustainable yet. But those countries that if they could supply more of these minerals to Europe, we could diversify our supply and also increase it in the future. And so in the strategy, it all sounds very nice. But of course, then you have to also actually go about and co-invest in, for example, in mines in other countries, be it in the Congo, in Australia, in Indonesia. And that's something where I have not seen a single concrete project, whereas we've seen already from the Americans, the Japanese have already been much more active in this, who also dependent on these critical minerals, who have committed real financial means to sponsor new mines, to commit real funding to sustainable innovation in the mining and processing sector. And that's sort of the thinking I feel we have to also adopt in our connectivity strategy. Don't get me wrong, if European companies or the EIB is financing metros in India, as we have now agreed in the EU-India connectivity strategy, for example, that's great for everyone. It's great for India, it's great for the European companies, it's great for connectivity, but it can't be everything. It's disconnected also from the kind of objectives that we have set out, the strategic objectives that we have set out internally. And I think that's where we have to get better.
Thank you, Tobias. Perhaps in a final round, pick up some of the additional questions. We could turn to what George highlighted as the really new dimension, which is security and defense. And there were some questions about how can the EU and its member states contribute very concretely to maritime security in Southeast Asia, or even very specifically in the Taiwan Straits. And as we get to the next stages of this process, can we expect more concrete initiatives from the EU side? Perhaps, George, I leave you the final word to pick up that question, but also sort of to wrap it up and maybe tell us something about, in general, what we can look forward to now on the EU side.
Yes, I thought you wanted me to wrap up, so I was waiting for the others to chip in first. So wrapping up at the end. Yes, on security and defense, I think there we have actually sort of got traction to move our activity into the region, which I think is a first, actually, pretty much. We have projects which are dealing with counterterrorism, cybersecurity issues, maritime security and crisis management with partner countries such as Vietnam, as a matter of interest. Those are ones which are developing at the moment. We have, as I said, these increased in port calls and more joint exercises which will take place. We have the Crimario project, which is going to go as far as into the Indo-Pacific, as far as the South Pacific, which is all to do with protecting critical maritime routes. And we have practical things like Copernicus, our satellite system, which is going through improvements. And as you know, it helps enormously in terms of disaster relief. And there was an exercise, for instance, concerning the Australian bushfires in which Copernicus was used. I've seen lots of output from the Copernicus satellites, and extremely accurate in terms of showing what is happening and where it's happening, and of great use to partners in the region. So in fact, in that particular case, there's a very good example of what is taking place. Also, of course, the ARF and our participation in that kind of forum is important. So that gives you an idea of some of the things in security defense. And what is written in the Council conclusions is actually new territory that has resulted as a consequence of the strategy, as there'll be new territory also in technology, I think, coming about as well. Sorry, just quickly on the EU-US relationship. Of course, you know, with the new Biden administration, there is a great wish to cooperate with the United States wherever possible, wherever it can be done. So obviously there is a push in that direction, obviously governed by common interest and our strategic autonomy in deciding what is good and what is not good for Europe. We had, of course, as was mentioned, December 2020, the EU-US Agenda for Global Change, which was a joint communication issued on just as soon as the results were known of the elections. And there, Indo-Pacific is mentioned. And there also is working together on democracies, working for democracies in the region is also mentioned. On the EU and ASEAN are cooperating. I can confirm to you on Myanmar and trying to resolve the issue there. Of course, it's difficult. ASEAN itself has tried or is trying to resolve that particular sort of development took place there. But EU and ASEAN are working, so it's not just we have imposed a sort of certain limited number of sanctions on Myanmar, but we're also in dialogue with ASEAN as to what to do about the situation there. So I'll leave it at that for the time being, hopefully. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much again to all our speakers, George, Chiaoning, Hwee, and Tobias. Some sharp questions there, and also from the audience, of course, so thank you for that also. It is cliche to say, but it's true that, you know, for those of us who have worked on EU foreign policy for a long time, it is actually, I think, quite positive that we are now having this sort of strategic debate, which I think 10 years ago we would not have had, thinking about what is an EU role, even in the security and defense sphere in this part of the world. So I think at least interests are now front and center of the Brussels debate, and that is where it should be. So we will definitely pursue this topic also at the Egmont Institute. I look forward to being in touch with all of you in the panel, hopefully in the flesh. Brussels, you know, one can eat very well. Belgium is very good at food, but to have real Asian food, one has to go to Asia, though, and I say that on the authority of my Taiwanese husband, who has very, very strict norms. So I do hope that I can visit all of you again wherever you are based. So thank you again. Watch this space for more on EU foreign policy, EU strategy, on great powers, and on Asia. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a nice rest of the day wherever you are. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sven. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you.
Lovely to meet you all. Take care. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you, George.